I am your host, Katie, and today we are incredibly honored to bring you a conversation with one of the world's leading voices in conservation biology, Dr. Reed Noss. And so he has spent decades at the intersection of science and wildlands advocacy. He's a professor and whose work has really shaped the way that we understand ecological networks, the role of ecosystem health, and really the urgent need for large-scale wilderness protection. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about the future of biodiversity, climate change, connectivity, how science can really inform and empower grassroots action, and of course his story. And so I'm really excited to bring this conversation to our listeners who might be scientists, policymakers, or really just someone who loves the woods and waters of Virginia and beyond. So settle in. And sir, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here, Katie. Thank you.
Yeah, and so your journey as a naturalist really began in Ohio. And so we'll talk about some of the other areas that you've done some really great work. But could you tell us about a formative experience from your childhood that really shaped your passion for ecology?
Sure. Well, I grew up in southwestern Ohio, south of Dayton, and if you know where that is. And I was very fortunate to live in a relatively new suburb in a rural area that still had lots of woods and streams, just within a couple blocks of my home. So every possible minute, I was out there in the woods. I was wading in the streams. And I've had a lot of formative moments, so it was difficult to pick one, but one that always comes back to me was I was wading in the stream one day. I was maybe 8 years old, and you see all these little fish in the water. You call them minnows, but you don't know anything else about them. So I decided to come back with my mom's kitchen strainer. And so I scooped up a bunch of these little fish, and I was just amazed because from the top, they look kind of a dull brown. But southwestern Ohio is an area of very rich fish diversity. And when I scooped up these fish, there were several different species, all kinds of colors. There was a stone roller, there was a Johnny darter, there was a rainbow darter. And in my naivety, I thought the rainbow darter was a baby rainbow trout. But rainbow trout are native to only the rivers that flow into the Pacific Ocean. So I was wrong on that. But these fish were just amazingly colored, and I'd never been aware of that before. And it's amazing I didn't turn out a fish biologist because that was one of my entries into natural history. But frankly, it's not all a positive story because maybe a year or so later, after that initial experience, I'd been going out frequently and looking at these fish. One day I'm wading up the stream and there's an oily sheen on the water. And then I start to see all these dead fish floating by. And so I walk further up the stream, and some person had a garage near the stream, next to the stream, and they dumped all their old paint, their paint thinner, their pesticides, and everything else just right out into the stream. And it had killed basically all the fish and snakes, crayfish, everything. And I could not understand how someone could be so callous toward nature. It amazed me. And so, experiences like that, experiencing nature in a positive way and then seeing it destroyed. And also that rural area where I grew up was rapidly transforming into a dense suburban neighborhood. And so all the woods we played in were being cut down by developers. So it made me angry. And so that kind of spurred my environmentalism at an early age.
Yeah, and I feel like that's how it starts for a lot of folks in this space. The wonder and the amazement, and then to see how there is this fairly large group of people who really doesn't seem to care about any of it or its role in sort of the greater, ecosystem of our planet on a global scale. And so with your schooling, you earned your MS in ecology at Tennessee and PhD in wildlife ecology. And so can you tell us a little bit about that academic work, some of your key insights, and specifically on habitat edges and how that kind of led to your greater conservation practice.
I sure will. I actually started at University of Tennessee as a PhD student, and there was a project I was going to work on with Dr. Mike Pelton, who's a very famous bear biologist, now retired. But he had a contract coming up with the Fish and Wildlife Service to study the biological feasibility of reintroducing gray wolves into the Smoky Mountains and the Southern Appalachians. And he told me, hey, if you're interested in this, this could be a PhD project. So that's what I was going to do. But sure enough, by the time I actually arrived on campus and went to talk to Dr. Pelton, the Fish and Wildlife Service had canceled the project because of political opposition. So I had to find a new project. So I linked up with the herpetologist there, Dr. Sandy Echternacht, and I was going to study salamanders, niche partitioning, how salamanders divide their habitat on the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee. And I was getting started on that, but I didn't have any funding. And then I got this amazing opportunity to go to Nicaragua on the Caribbean coast in this totally undeveloped area, which is a little village there called Pearl Lagoon, and look at the feasibility of establishing an international research center and ecological reserve on the Caribbean coast. So that was pretty exciting. Unfortunately, the night before I flew down to Nicaragua, this was early 1978, the main opposition leader to the government there, and the government was supporting my work, right? The opposition leader was assassinated, and the whole country was in chaos and on strike. So I couldn't get anywhere. I couldn't get to my field site. I finally got out there, and to make a long story short, I did not stay. I only stayed about 3 months, and I got some great data. I got some great experiences, but not enough for a dissertation, of course, because a civil war had erupted. My own life was threatened, and they shot my roommate by mistake. It was a pretty ugly experience. I finally got back to the States and said, you know, enough of this. I'm going to get a quick master's degree. And so I studied birds, which I also knew well at that time, at a place where I knew where I grew up in Ohio. So it was a place that was very easy. And I didn't go back to school for a number of years. I worked in between for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, specifically in the Natural Heritage Program. And then I went later back to University of Tennessee with Dr. Larry Harris. And maybe some of you have heard of his book, The Fragmented Forest. That was published in 1984. It was the first book-length treatment of habitat fragmentation, which is a fairly new term in those days. And I studied birds again in an old-growth hardwood forest near Gainesville, Florida. And I was interested in seeing whether a naturally patchy old-growth forest with lots of tree fall gaps, and old forests are much more patchy or heterogeneous than younger forests because the trees are bigger, they fall, they leave holes in the canopy, which promotes shrub growth. And so basically you get more diversity in an old growth forest. And I was hoping that I would find that the old growth forest with all this patchiness would distract birds from going to the edge, because artificial edges had been documented for a number of years as being very bad for native birds because they're ecological traps. That's the terminology used. They're attracted to the edge because it's an opening, because they were once birds of these forest gaps. So they're attracted to this edge, but once they're there, they suffer higher rates of nest predation from squirrels and raccoons and snakes that are concentrated along edges, and also nest parasitism, brood parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds. And sure enough, I found that a naturally patchy old growth forest had vastly reduced edge effects compared to younger areas of forest in the same area. And I also had control plots deep in the interior of the forest. So it was, you know, kind of a nerdy study, but it was interesting. I think there's some insights. One more reason to preserve old growth forest is to reduce the attraction of birds to edge.
Sure. And yeah, like you said, one more reason. There are a number of reasons to preserve old growth forest. And so, we could dive down a few rabbit trails. I mean, it's totally another podcast. You are in the midst of a civil war and your roommate. I'm so sorry to hear that. But you talk about political opposition. I'd love to hear, especially, for our advocates that support Wild Virginia and activists that are really ingrained in our work in both protecting water quality and then preserving habitat, connectivity, and wildlife corridors in our state. It can be exhausting in the face of political opposition. So, how do you recommend folks stay energized in the face of that?
Well, I think for most of us, the answer is just to get out into nature. I mean, I'd be a total wreck if I didn't get out at least some every single day into nature. That for me is, getting out into the real world and ignoring this artificial, insane world of politics is the only way to stay halfway sane. I won't claim to be totally sane, but at least halfway sane.
Sure. Yeah, likewise. I mean, you can certainly find me at the river any day where it's not completely monsoon storming these days.
I hear you.
So in the 80s, you co-developed foundational concepts in conservation planning like regional landscape approach and corridor design. So how do you see these ideas evolving in today's climate changed world?
Yeah, so in the late 70s and early 80s, I started reading a lot of biogeography and also landscape ecology, which was pretty much just a European discipline in those days. It's really looking at the heterogeneity of landscapes, the kind of thing I was just talking about, and recognizing patches and corridors and matrix and all these different components. And it seemed to me that, these ideas naturally fit in with conservation and conservation planning. At the time, they weren't really being applied. And so I started applying some of these concepts from landscape ecology to conservation. And it initially started when I was working for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And my boss gave me one of the best assignments of my life. He said, Reed, I want you to do some thinking, take a few months, figure out what we're missing in Ohio in conservation. What can we do better? What could we do that we're not doing already? And Ohio, like most Midwestern states, especially, had been focusing on small remnant natural areas, often climatic relics like kettle hole bogs and seepage fens and so on, which are really cool. They're loaded with rare species, but those were species rare in Ohio, but probably most of them very common further north. What we weren't doing was trying to conserve at the characteristic vegetation and flora and fauna of the region, which was basically old growth deciduous forest and an intact food web all the way up to, wolves and cougars and so on. So I put together a proposal for Southern Ohio. In Southern Ohio, most of it had been losing population for decades after the collapse of timber industry, the steel industry, um, and other industries. Farmland was marginal there to begin with, so most of the farms had been abandoned. It was a perfect place for what I called wilderness recovery, to start recognizing these big patches of public land we already had, expanding them and connecting them by corridors. So this was about 1982, and so by early 83, I wrote a report, had a bunch of maps, putting together all these linkages and so on, and presented them to my boss, who thought it was great. He passed it up the chain of command, and as I like to say, I got laughed out of Ohio. The director of the division was angry. He said, "We've wasted all these months of your salary to put together this bullshit." He thought it was totally impractical, ridiculous. And so I started looking right away for another job. And I found a job in Florida, And once in Florida, I worked for the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, which is Florida's heritage program. So a very similar job to what I had in Ohio. And that's when I met Larry Harris, who I talked about a moment later, and at the University of Florida. And Larry and I started putting together proposals for linking areas by corridors, exactly the kind of thing that I had been doing in Ohio. And it was just fortuitous. I met Larry, and he was thinking along the same lines in Florida to what I was doing in Ohio. But I wanted to step further than Larry wanted to go. I said, let's just do a whole statewide plan. And Larry said, oh, no, that'll scare the hell out of people. We'll get terrible backlash. But I went ahead and did it anyway and published it first in actually a report to the Florida Panther Technical Advisory Council, because Florida panther was my main focal species because they require the most area. They roam widely. They were critically endangered, confined to South Florida, but originally they roamed over most of the Southeast and were contiguous with the eastern cougar. In fact, today, based on molecular evidence, only one subspecies is recognized by most biologists for all of North America. So the puma, the panther, the cougar, the mountain lion, they're all the same, not only same species, but the same subspecies. But legally, the Florida panther is still a separate subspecies. In any case, I put together a statewide map. I used a big, this was pre-GIS. So I used a big wall-sized map, a satellite image. I used Mylar overlays and magic markers and created this network of interlinked reserves. Very similar to my Ohio map, but more ambitious. Like Ohio, this too at first was thought to be radical, totally impractical. There were only a few people interested in it. All the major environmental groups like Audubon Society, Nature Conservancy, etc., had no interest whatsoever. So the plan languished, nothing happened. This was mid 80s until the mid 90s. And then a guy named Tom Hochter, um, who's now actually, in a way, my boss. I work half time for the University of Florida's Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, and Tom Hochter is the director of the center. And he started looking at my maps, and he was also a student of Larry Harris. He looked at what I was doing in the 80s and using his GIS skills and much better data at that time, he put together the Florida Ecological Greenways Network in the late 90s. And that was published in the year 2000. So 15 years after my first map. But that started being used by state agencies for planning. And then in 2021, the Florida legislature, and this is amazing, this is a conservative southern state. It didn't used to be so conservative, but now it's far right. But in 2021, a bipartisan bill, the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act, passed unanimously in the Florida legislature. And the Florida Wildlife Corridor is 18 million acres, 10 million of which is already in protected areas and conservation areas. So these would include national forests and state forests, which are multiple use. But these days, unlike the 80s, when I was first in Florida, they're being managed pretty well. So they qualify as conservation areas. And so this bill would protect the entire Florida Wildlife Corridor, which includes the 10 million acres already conserved and an 8 million additional acres to be acquired, both by fee simple purchase and by conservation easements. Now that's being pursued pretty actively. So far, they've spent about 500 million a year, but that's less than half of what's really needed. So there's a lot of challenges that remain.
Sure. And I know that here in Virginia, we certainly experience some of those challenges as we are trying to protect and connect fragmented habitat. I know that we've referenced the Florida Wildlife Corridor. I mean, I've been with the organization almost 10 years now, and we've certainly referenced it with your work. And, now Virginia, there are some exciting headway happening with the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan and,
Cool.
some money. But like you said, it's more expensive than you than you realize, I suppose, before you embark on this journey.
It is. The problem, Florida is the fastest growing state. We have a net growth of an average of 1,000 new people per day moving into Florida. Now, the death rate is higher than the birth rate in Florida. So all the population growth is through immigration, both domestic, it's about 50-50 domestic and international immigration. The biggest single contributor is New York. And one of those people is Donald Trump, who
Mm.
immigrated from New York to Florida. And in fact, that's part of the problem. The people who are moving to Florida now are often from blue states, but they're conservative people, so they want to get out of the blue states and come to a nice red state like Florida. And so we have this tremendous population growth. We have a swing to the right. And so they don't want to spend all that much money on conservation, even though the legislature, in its wisdom, decided to do this. And by the way, the main reason that this turned out to be successful, why all of a sudden, in the 80s it was radical, but now it's bipartisan, is because the big landowners in Florida are cattle ranchers. Florida
Mm.
is the original cowboy state. And so we have these old families, 8, 10 generations even in Florida, own a lot of land. And these were the same people that in the 80s, I was getting death threats, same families. I was literally getting death threats. We couldn't let our daughter play in the front yard
Wow.
because of my map. And they thought it was a government land grab. I was going to, we were going to come in and take their land. They realized over the years that, of course, that wasn't true, but they realized over the years that actually they could benefit from this by selling conservation easements to the state. They could keep on doing what they've always been doing, grazing cattle. They just couldn't build developments, and they couldn't sell out to developers. They had to keep it in its existing use. And so many of the largest landowners became gung ho about the Florida Wildlife Corridor because of the economic benefit. Now, of course, there's others that are happy to sell out to developers. And the biggest, actually, the largest private landowner in Florida, and this might surprise some people, they own nearly 1 million acres, is the Mormon Church. They
Mm.
have virtually no interest in conservation. They are developing their land as quickly as they can, building new cities of 500,000 people out in the middle of nowhere. The Mormon Church is one of the biggest threats to Florida right now. But there's others. There's others that are doing that. But fortunately, a lot of the real big power brokers came to see the wisdom. They wanted to keep the land in their family, continue the tradition of ranching. And so they came on board, and that's why it's successful. It's just not enough money. We just need more money because so much of what is within that unprotected 8 million acres is disappearing every day because of new development, with 1,000 people moving in every day.
Sure. Wow. Yeah, that is really interesting and surprising about the Mormon Church.
Yeah, just
So, research shows that corridor connected populations have greater genetic flow and survivability, which makes sense. Could you share some surprising or lesser known ecological benefits from corridor implementation?
well, some of these benefits from corridors, from big, broad corridors especially, go beyond the benefits for wildlife. There are also many benefits for people, ecosystem services, we call them. Um, and one of those that's especially relevant in Florida, we're a low-lying state. If you've been here, it's pretty darn flat. There are some hills along the old ridges that were above the sea level during the various Pleistocene interglacials. In fact, Florida has more high ground than people recognize. Our highest elevations, even on the peninsula, are, about 300 feet above sea level, 100 meters. So, um, what is true, though, is that most of the Florida Wildlife Corridor uh, is situated on river systems because these are kind of the natural dendritic pathways for wildlife movement for most species, large animals across the state. And these rivers in Florida, most of them, fortunately, are undammed, so they flood. And we have these big riverine swamps, floodplain swamps Cypress and Tupelo are some of the dominant species. And they flood, but yet people still will build in the floodplain if they can. And so by preserving these corridors, these riparian corridors along the rivers and in the lowlands and along the coast, which also floods regularly, especially with our increase in hurricane intensity, by preserving these areas, you're preventing floods which kill people and are tremendously damage property in Florida. And some parts of Florida are starting to realize, oh, it's not so smart to build in these areas, but there's other counties where as soon as a hurricane comes along and floods everybody out, first thing they do is we're going to rebuild. And so sure enough, they go on building right in these flood-prone areas. But the Florida Wildlife Corridor, if we can get it protected and areas beyond the corridor, Wildlife Corridor doesn't do everything. There are other areas, especially along the coast, that aren't connected to the Florida Wildlife Corridor because they've been heavily developed. They're smaller. But those areas need to be protected as well, or we'll continue to have these flooding problems.
And I know that that is something anyone who watches the news or is on social media or pays attention these days, flood resilience is a big deal. And so let's talk about some of your books. You have quite a few, and I'd love to hear um I'd love to hear how critical are disturbance regimes like prescribed fire and keeping ecosystems healthy and resilient to sea level rise.
Sure. So basically, we used in the old days. I was a member of Earth First. It's a fairly controversial group, as you know. It changed a lot over the years, but in Ohio, I was the representative for Ohio Earth First, and then in Florida for Florida Earth First, where we had a newsletter and regular meetings. And my first publication, which was presented this idea of what is now the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and the map, which I was talking about earlier, looks almost identical to the modern Florida Wildlife Corridor. That was first published in the Earth First Journal. But I called it a wilderness recovery network, and wilderness recovery over the years was shortened by Dave Foreman, a prominent Earth First leader, to rewilding around 1990. And that's actually when Earth First split up, and a lot of us went and founded the Wildlands Project. And a lot of the other Earth Firsters were more oriented towards social justice, which is great, but we wanted to keep the original mission. But anyway, rewilding became a big thing, and it as it should, and it's still growing. It's an international movement now. But most of the focus is on big animals, especially carnivores and large herbivores. And that's appropriate because they play very critical roles in the ecosystem. I've been trying to give more attention over the last few years to natural disturbance regimes, such as natural fire regimes and hydrologic regimes like flooding that we were just talking about. And so restoring areas that are capable of accommodating these natural disturbance regimes, such as periodic floods, as we were saying, we got to preserve these river corridors and coastal areas that are going to flood, even without human-caused sea level rise. They're going to flood. And with sea level rise, of course, it's much more critical. Now, the relation of fire to sea level rise is not direct, but obviously relation to hydrological regimes, keeping rivers vegetated, their sides vegetated, not dammed. For example, going beyond Florida, one little known natural community that is very important for biodiversity are so-called river scour barrens. So many rivers, especially in the Appalachians, have a natural flood regime that at certain times of the year will scour the sides of the stream and prevent woody vegetation, forest, from growing and maintaining these open grassland type communities, which are called river scour barrens or river scour prairies. Also, ice, movement of ice, in the colder areas in the winter or in the spring with the breakup is very important for maintaining river scour communities. There's many endangered species that depend on scouring by water or ice on an annual basis to maintain their habitat. And so this kind of natural disturbance regime is, I believe, fundamental to rewilding. We can't just put big animals back out there. We have to think about all the small things, these small habitats like river scour barrens that are critically important in the bigger picture. So more attention to natural disturbances, I think, has to be a mission of the conservation community. I'm not,
Sure.
I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly, but
No, a lot of good information. And so, thinking about the advocacy portion, I mean, one thing really important to me personally is getting the next generation of advocates and scientists, policymakers, all those, really important people within the within this wildlife space interested in protecting it. And so, you've noted a decline in students' exposure to natural history. And I'm it's a concern because this next generation really experiences things differently. I mean, everything is so digital now.
yeah,
Spending that time outside, like for you and myself, where I was in the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River and in the woods and experiencing this natural beauty, and then, like you, watching it get destroyed. So how can universities or NGOs really help reignite naturalist sort of, maybe training, but excitement in the next generation?
yeah. Well, this type of education has to go has to be transmitted at all ages, implemented at all ages. So back in the early to mid 20th century, nature study, it was called, was a required part of the curriculum in many or even most school districts throughout the United States, and which was basically natural history. And so kids, as part of their curriculum, would learn about the native plants and animals in their area. They would take field trips, etc. Now, some of that, this was my original field. I was in outdoor education or environmental education. I was an education major for my bachelor's degree and focused on environmental education. I worked in the summers at youth camps that were science or natural history oriented. I taught for a year after my bachelor's degree at an outdoor school in Ohio where kids would come and spend a week. It was spend the night, with their teachers and then go out by day in small groups with naturalists to learn natural history. But and this was in the 70s, mid 70s, but at the same time, there was a shift away from classic natural history, shift away from science, definitely, and it became much more, fun games to play outdoors, which, has its place, but I was really turned off by that. And so I got out of that field and decided to go into, harder science because I couldn't get into all the game playing. And a lot of these leading environmental educators were literally one guy whose name was Steve Van Meter, published a couple books, Acclimatization and Acclimatizing. One of his statements in the books that I will always remember is we never name things. So don't teach the kids the names of these plants and animals. That'll bore them. Just play games with them outdoors, and then they'll come to appreciate nature. And there's some logic in that, but that was going way too far. And so the whole environmental education movement, in my opinion, went off track. And so now funding's been cut in most school districts, not all, for any kind of environmental education. There's still some that have these outdoor experiences and go to these outdoor schools. But from what I've heard, I still have colleagues that stayed in that field. It's nothing like it used to be. The heyday was the 60s and 70s. So we need to get that back, start teaching kids because I mean, ideally your parents teach you this kind of thing, but most parents don't know to teach this stuff anymore. Maybe they could have, when they had themselves had nature study in school, but not these days, especially with our increasing urbanizing population. So we need to get that back in, and then all the way up to universities where natural history is disappearing from the universities. I wrote an editorial for the journal Conservation Biology back in the mid 90s. I was editor in chief of the journal at that time. Um, the editorial was entitled "The Naturalists Are Dying Off." And that was my own experience that most of the really good field naturalists were really old and they were dying. And we weren't training enough new ones to take their place. And this is still true, even though there's been something of a resurgence, even in the Ecological Society of America, which is a professional society of ecologists, the largest in the world, which is the professional organization I've belonged to the longest since 1976. They have a natural history section, which is really cool. But still, for the most part, at universities, the natural history type courses like ornithology, herpetology, taxonomy of vascular plants, um, and so on, field botany, they're being eliminated from the curriculum, or they're just not taught very regularly. And then the museums that are often centered at universities are being way cut back. They don't have the staffing they used to. And moreover, the perks for publishing natural history type of work, if you can publish it at all, and that's a challenge. Um, they're not anything compared to people who are doing molecular work, genomics or medical science related work. And so that's where the money is at universities, and that's where you can get big grants, multi-million-dollar grants. Well, not so much now with Trump. I mean, no one's getting any money, but until recently. But natural history, there's no money for that, hardly at all. And so it's unfortunately a lot of it's purely a financial thing. If there's not money to support naturalists and to hire naturalists at universities, we're not going to keep that tradition alive.
Yeah, which is quite sad. So I encourage anybody listening, go find a local group. But speaking, you mentioned urbanization. How do you see rewilding principles being applied beyond the wilderness in those urban areas, especially in, areas of the Southeast or the, general East Coast, kind of where we are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I originally focused, as I mentioned, on wilderness recovery. That's what I called, and well, not just me, I didn't coin the term. Actually, another Earth First founder, Howie Wolk, coined the term wilderness recovery back in like 1980, I believe, or 81. But wilderness recovery, as I mentioned, came to be called rewilding, and it was very much focused on wilderness and big carnivores and huge areas. But along with my increased emphasis on natural disturbance regimes, I also came to realize that you can implement rewilding at many different spatial scales and along an entire gradient from big wild areas, wilderness, all the way to, connected or even disconnected patches of natural or semi-natural habitat in urban areas. And this is very controversial, but there's virtually all environmentalists support urban infill or densification, where vacant or underutilized is the term. I hate that term because it means utilized by people. Well, there's a lot of animals that utilize these habitats and plants. But the idea is to take these vacant lots and green spaces in cities and build dense housing there. I think that's a huge mistake. I am opposed to densification in most cases for that reason. City kids and city people need those green spaces. We should protect them as parks and as greenways, not turn them into apartment complexes. The answer to urban sprawl is not urban densification, in my view. It is to reduce population growth. degrowth, ideally, reverse population growth. And that's obviously it's very controversial. It's not easy to do. It has to do with incentives and disincentives. There's a number of economists now who are on that bandwagon of degrowth and are writing about it. It is very possible to have a sustainable, steady state, steady state society with gradually declining economy and population. And so this natalist, pro-natalist stuff you hear all the time now, quite popular. It's in the New York Times all the time that, oh, we have a population crisis. There's too few people. Um, that's nonsense. There's too many people. If you look at the value of other living things, every new person is space taken away for other living things. We need those green spaces in urban areas. But this spectrum of wildness is then can be echoed in a spectrum of rewilding. We can rewild these urban areas. We can rewild degraded agricultural lands, and we can rewild even big wild areas by reintroducing large carnivores that had plenty of habitat there. They were just directly eliminated by shooting and trapping. And it's you know what? There's been some evidence for a long time that large carnivores, even though they occasionally kill people, right? Mountain lions in California, they kill about a person a year, I think it is. Alligators in Florida kill about a person a year. So yeah, there's a danger, but compare that to the number of people that die in auto accidents. And you know what? One of the biggest sources of human mortality in auto accidents? It's deer, overabundant deer populations. So there was a study in Wisconsin a couple of years ago that calculated, and I don't remember the figures, but millions of dollars saved by having wolves in Wisconsin. Now I'm spending this summer up in Wisconsin. That's where I am right now. And the other day I was out walking my dog, just 10 minutes at a trail from my house, and a pack of wolves broke out calling, very close by. My poor dog was scared to death, put his tail between his legs, head down, and headed back towards the car. I told him, no, that's actually in the direction of the wolves. You don't want to be going that way. They're just telling us this is their territory. They're not going to attack us. Wolves virtually never attack humans in North America. There have been incidents in Europe and Asia, especially in the past. But mountain lions, I mentioned, do. But in the long run, these large carnivores actually save lives by reducing collisions with deer and people dying in those collisions.
I mean, sure. And in Virginia, we're certainly no stranger to that. I mean, wildlife vehicle collisions is a big concern and one of the driving factors in a couple of projects that we've been a part of in implementing fencing to funnel wildlife through underpasses that were already, you know, a part of interstates. And then, of course, taking into account these deer vehicle collisions and how much it cost in, building future projects. So, definitely something we're a part of, but and if anybody's really interested, there have been some pretty incredible rewilding examples across the globe in urban areas that I really find fascinating and just super necessary. But I want to go back to your books. I know we had spoken about I believe it was the fire ecology book. But like I said, you've written a number or and contributed to a number of others, and so I wanted to see with all of your publications and books, which project or study gives you the most pride and why.
Well, as far as books, I think there's two that stand out that I'm proud of because they've had some influence. One is my first book, which it was Noss and Cooperrider. Alan Cooperrider was my co-author. He wrote about a third of the book. I wrote about two-thirds. It was based on an interagency short course on biodiversity that the two of us developed with funding from the Bureau of Land Management. So we started these out west. I lived in Oregon at the time, and We held these short courses. They were a week long. We had two versions. We had one for field staff, land managers, botanists, wildlife biologists, et cetera. And another one for administrators. We even had the chief of the Forest Service, as one of our students in these classes. So we took our lectures basically from this book, from these courses, and compiled them into a book we called Saving Nature's Legacy, which was published in 1994. And that book it's by far the best selling of the books that, of course, these kinds of books don't sell really well compared to novels, but compared to other environmental type books, it sold very well. Many people have used it in courses. And so, I'm very proud of our contribution with this book. We had a lot of concepts in that book, such as that we need to protect about 50% of each region to meet well-established conservation goals that were considered extremely radical at the time, but that are now well accepted. So in general, that's the thing that I'm probably most proud of, that I think I was ahead of my time. I proposed a lot of things back starting in the early 1980s that were thought to be totally hopelessly radical, like the Ohio and Florida examples, and now are very well accepted. So I'm proud of that. I had an influence, and there's a lag time, like maybe 20, 30, 40 years lag time, but that's okay. Eventually they catch on. And then the other thing, another book I'm particularly proud of is Forgotten Grasslands of the South. People, when they think of prairies, they think of the Great Plains, and bison and all that. Well, actually, we had bison throughout the South until early 19th century when they were eliminated by shooting, overhunting. We had grasslands throughout the South. And what people don't recognize is that, a lot of the South was developed quite early. It was settled. The Indians kept the native people, the indigenous people, kept natural fires going, and they lit fires themselves, right? So most of the fires in the South originally were, of course, started by lightning. And in Florida, even at the time of European settlement, vast majority of fires were lightning ignited, not set by indigenous people, which is it's just part of, it's a misconception that native people were out there burning the landscape all the time in every region. That was very much true in some regions, but in Florida, which is the lightning capital of North America, there was more than enough lightning to take care of those needs. And Florida was very little settled. But Florida has more native grassland still today than any other southern state. But native grasslands extended up through Virginia, west through much of Kentucky and Tennessee, in the Ohio River Valley, southern Ohio, where I grew up. There was native grassland in southern Ohio, southern Indiana, into the Ozarks, down through Alabama, the Black Belt prairies, but a lot more than that, into the coastal prairies of Louisiana and Texas, et cetera, et cetera. Now, 90% of that grassland has been destroyed. And it happened early. Cotton was a big factor. Cotton agriculture eliminated these great, longleaf pine forests, actually savannas, not true forests, of the Southeast, which extended, the northern extent was actually in southeastern Virginia of the longleaf pine savanna. But this was, something like 97% of longleaf pine savannas have been destroyed. So a huge loss. And so people don't see grasslands today, so they're not aware that those were there in the past. But another factor is fire exclusion, that if you don't allow natural fires to burn, or if you don't burn them themselves, and of course, as the landscape is fragmented, there aren't going to be enough lightning strikes in one particular place to keep that burning often enough. And these communities, these longleaf pine savannas, for example, require frequent low intensity ground fire on the order of every 1 to 3 years. And that's very frequent. And the natural lighting regime will do that over a large area. But for smaller areas, you have to do prescribed burning. But in any case, my book, Forgotten Grasslands, I went into the history and documented that these grasslands were distributed throughout the Southeast. It took a lot of work. I spent 5.5 years on this project. I traveled all around, met with naturalists, went out to a lot of the remnants of the original grasslands. But it had an influence. For one thing, it inspired the founding of a new organization, the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, which I'm also affiliated with as the chief science advisor. But the founders are Dwayne Estes of Austin Peay State University in Kentucky, and Theo Witzel, who was with the Arkansas Natural Heritage Program, but is now with Southeastern Grasslands Institute full time. And they have a multi-million-dollar annual budget and employ some 20 people working to restore grasslands around the Southeast. And they were, largely inspired by my book. So I'm proud of that. I think it's really cool. And we're still doing more.
Sure. Yeah, and you should be very proud. It's all, like you said, kind of ahead of your time at the time. But I encourage everybody to go check out all of Dr. Noss's books. And so looking ahead at 30 years from now, speaking of being ahead of the times, taking a look at or thinking about what the last 30 to 40 years have looked like and all the work that has been done. I mean, especially with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, even just thinking about sort of the trajectory of that and, the recent legislation passed in 2021. What do you hope the legacy of all of your work on corridors, rewilding, and ecosystem resilience will look like?
Well, for one, I hope that other states and regions will see what we've done in Florida and try to emulate it to some extent. It's going to be a little different, the politics and the landscapes in different states, of course. And actually, my most recent book, which is in press now, it was supposed to be out this fall, but the press, University Press of Florida, is delaying it to the spring because that's when their big release is. It's a marketing thing. But we go over the entire history and the science of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, going back to the early days of my maps and Larry Harris's maps in the 1980s. And we have a final chapter in that book from people written by people outside Florida who discuss how the Florida model or something similar to that of core areas and corridors and so on has been implemented elsewhere, including Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which was directly inspired by the Florida model. So this book goes over all that history and as well as all the techniques, the modeling techniques, the mapping techniques, etc. The land trust, we have a chapter on land trust and how they contribute to this. But I'm hoping that other regions will be inspired by what we've done, in a conservative southeastern state and try to do something similar in their states. And there are some examples. New Jersey has an official goal of protecting 50% of its landscape, at least last I heard, unless they've changed it. But that was a state policy. And there's some other states that are coming close to that, or at least have adopted 30 by 30, 30% protected by 2030. And some states like California, they're considering protected only rigorously protected areas like wilderness or national parks. And they're right about there on 30% now, just looking at the most strictly protected areas. So that's quite an accomplishment. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that rewilding will catch on, that we will start to have more habitat protected. And the most important thing is dealing with roads, so these animals can move around without getting hit by cars and killed. And so reducing eliminating, closing unnecessary roads, constructing wildlife crossings and associated fencing to funnel animals into the crossing. And that's actually been a big part of my research for the last 15, almost 20 years, working when I was at University of Central Florida and now at the University of Florida. A guy named Dan Smith, who is a well-known road ecologist. He's published a book on the topic, an edited volume, and many articles. But he was my postdoc at University of Central Florida, and he's now on the staff of the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning at University of Florida with me and Tom Hochter and others. And we do a lot of road ecology research. I'm hoping road ecology will grow and people will start implementing more of these wildlife crossings everywhere, because it's without those crossings, we really can't do rewilding at scale. We need to eliminate or reduce at least those barriers and mortality sinks in the landscape.
And I really do believe that we can get there. And I'm really excited to, once your book is released, I think that'll be a great model for other states, since you've been able to do so much incredible work in the state that you have. And so I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. And so if anyone wants to get involved in conservation, road ecology, or just doesn't even know where to start, I mean, you can check out more information on Rewilding, grab one of Dr. Reed Noss's books. You can also find some pretty incredible maps online of migratory corridors of North America, and just check out what the movement looks like. And yeah, I mean, Rewilding, I have high goals, and I know that we can achieve them. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of Wild Virginia's Old Dominion EcoBuzz. Wild Virginia is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to protecting and connecting your favorite wild places. So you can learn more about our work at www.wildvirginia.org.